Thank you for inviting me for today's presentation, Beyond Land Acknowledgement. I chose this particular presentation due to the celebratory date for the residential school here in Eastern Canada, in the Shubenacadie Residential School. It closed in June of 1966, and so a lot of our survivors are just into its second year of this new era of people within our families that haven't participated with the residential schools. So it's a very timely and important event. So we're moving away from performative scripts to a learning journey that's grounded in truth. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission had calls to action and the significance around the local treaty accountability with all nations across Turtle Island in Canada. And this was put together by our Indigenous Education and Reconciliation team. Move to the next slide. So we'd like to start this by opening up the space with care, which is really, really important when we're talking about something that's so uncomfortable. Because the uncomfortableness is having to speak truth and to speak about a truth of where we're at right now and where we should be acknowledging as a people here that share this, the territories here with Indigenous people. So speaking from and this is where speaking your truth and being honest is really important. So sharing your own experiences rather than speaking for others. And that's why the crafting of individual and organizational land acknowledgement statements are so important, because they represent you as an entity. They represent your voice and the values and the commitments that you're making to Indigenous people. The second piece is listening to understand. And this is where humility and respect come in the Indigenous traditional values. Practicing deep listening and setting aside some time for people to be able to have a discussion and be able to share their interpretations, their translation of something, but mostly how they're hearing it. And how you're receiving it and how you're portraying something. The next is to step up and step back. And this is where courage and humility come into play. So creating space for others while contributing your own voice. When we're thinking about a land acknowledgement and the important points in it, there's, the three major points is just acknowledging the territory that you're taking up space in. And the second is acknowledging any kind of treaty or current state that Indigenous people are proclaiming and wanting to elevate that voice. The next is intent does not erase impact. When we talk about communication, words have a lot of power behind its impact, and you could not mean to cause harm by simply stating something. I had a interesting conversation with a municipality that I was supporting and had helped in crafting their land acknowledgement statement. And once legal had come through doing their last review of the land acknowledgement, they said, well, we need to take out unceded. One word caused so much conversation and learning and unlearning. One word. So if that caused so much sensitivity on that side, imagine what one word in a land acknowledge could mean on the other way when speaking to and about Indigenous people that you are sharing space with. So our words can still cause harm, even if we have the greatest of intentions. And so I really wanted to, put this together in helping people. And when they're looking at their land acknowledgement, when they're wanting to get to a point of review, and being very particular and having conversations about each of the words that you're putting in there and what does it mean to you. And it, would be a great conversation to ask, if you have Indigenous people in your circle or your network, is what does it mean to you? And to make sure that we are communicating with the same language that's reciprocal in its intent. In that as well, discomfort can be a part of learning. And this is where the last teaching comes in, and we talk about wisdom and relationship. So, even though it can make you be a little unsettled with proclaiming and stating and standing behind some truthful statements, this is where growth happens. This is being able to acknowledge and be able to approach, but then to move to the next phase of what that relationship will look like once you've agreed on how we, co-share and how we envision this relationship in this space that we share. Next slide. So in today's presentation, it's going to be a learning journey. Phase one is going to be of the foundations of place, where you're residing, where you're operating, where you're, doing work, and where you are living. So positionality and personal reflection. 8 hours of the day, you're a professional person, but you bring your own biases and your own individualism to your workplace as well. So it's really important to think about those things when you're, starting to think about what that land acknowledgement is going to encompass. Second, we move into the historical and the legal context. We talked about, briefly there about how municipality was so sensitive on one word. So what is the one word or words that your organization or yourself may not be comfortable with in proclaiming? So, but a part of that, and Call to Action 92 asks for Canadians, and especially corporate Canada, to learn about the history of Indigenous people in Canada and what the current legal context and the state is currently. We have old treaties, and we have numbered treaties, and we have treaties that are still being negotiated today in land settlements. So being aware of the treaties in the area that you operate or reside, have a read through the 94 calls to action and TRC, and they're broken down by themes. So relative to the work that you're in the space that you are sharing as a professional or as a personal, and it comes right down to education, health, corporate, history, arts. Like, it covers so many themes, and the wisdom it took for survivors across this country, thousands of Indigenous people contributing to what they hoped that would be seen, heard, remembered, and acknowledged. And that's what the importance of TRC is. And the impact that residential schools made. Now, I come from 4 generations of residential school survivors, descendant survivors, and that reality has, really opened my eyes to what I didn't know. Don't always assume that just being Indigenous that we know and understand, and that we're, very aware of that history. It was withheld from us as well, not only through the educational system, but through our own families, and not being able to share that dark history and have that conversation. The next is phase 3 are the strategic frameworks and the two-eyed seeing methodology. So for those of you that don't know what the two-eyed seeing framework is, it was penned by the late Dr. Merdina Marshall and her husband, Elder Albert Marshall, out of Eskasoni First Nation here in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia. And they talked about having the strength and the wisdom of Western and Indigenous in how we approach unpacking and understanding systems. And it's so crucial to have that because, and that's what reconciliation asks for, is allow us to lend you our lens into how we see the world, in how we see relationships, how we see interconnectedness, and then apply to how the vision of Western interpretation in all of those areas as well. And so you're seeing it a lot in science. You're seeing it in the arts. So two-eyed seeing is being applied in so many areas, and just lending how Indigenous people have been interpreting the world. And lastly is the practical application. And that comes to, once you think about all of these phases and all the things that come through with it, to start and sit down and have that first draft of creating your own meaningful land acknowledgement, and what words and what expression do you want to represent you and the organization that you're with. Can move to the next one. So when we talk about positionality, it's who we are in relation to a space. The land that shaped me, consider the geography and the stories that formed your values, what you were taught. So examining the narratives you received about this country's history and the biases that you may have, and what you were not taught. And so identifying the voices and the truths that were silent, especially for Indigenous people in this country. And lastly is, what responsibility do you carry now? Recognizing your position and what actions follow from that understanding. I come from Mi'kma'ki here in Cape Breton, Nova Scotia, but I shared half my life here in Canada and half in the New England states of the U.S. So even though Mi'kma'ki, the traditional territory, includes Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, bordering Quebec, and then goes into New England states, the land and the resources and our connection to the land were totally separate and very different from how we are here versus to how Mi'kmaq people are in their connection to land and language in the New England states. So those two experiences really contributed to how I have a more of a worldly view of Indigenous people and how different we can be, even being from the same nation. And we go into that conversation about what you were taught and what you're not taught. Residential school was never something that was in conversation. That was never shared with me in my youthful years, that residential school was a part of my own familial history. I always thought it was a they and a them, and little did I know it was I and us that were a part of that story. And then you think about what you weren't taught. And so, entering adulthood and university years, took courses at Cape Breton University to learn about the treaties, to learn about what TRC was and reconciliation. And it took conversational Mi'kmaq to read and write and speak Mi'kmaq conversationally. Took it all in university. So because I was not taught, because language wasn't as prevalent in the New England Mi'kmaq representation as it is here in Canada. That was the disadvantage that I had. And the responsibility that I carry now. I'm a mother, I'm a grandmother, and so I have a responsibility to my children to teach them, to encourage language and culture with them as well. As a treaty beneficiary, as a proud Mi'kmaq woman, I owe that to them, and I also owe that to my grandchildren. So, my grandchildren and my daughter have, just recently joined the powwow, the Mawiomi Trail. So they're dancing. They have their full regalia now, and they're dancing at powwows, and they have an interest in wanting to learn about our culture. Something that I didn't want to push on them, but I definitely encourage. And it's so empowering and beautiful to see when their own journey, allows them the space to make that decision without it being forced upon them. And each of my children at different phases of their adulthood and what they're ready for, whether it be language, culture, or traditions. And it's so great to see and witness as a mother and a grandmother. Can move to the next slide now. So how do we get here? Well, there's a whole lot of reasons to how we got here, but we wanted to give a little visual as to the path of it. So our Indigenous protocols, so our nations held protocols for entering territory. So that's why land acknowledgement is so important. When I enter a new territory, let's say the Mohawk area of Kahnawake in Quebec, there's a respectful ask and gesture that I have to make as someone that's entering, doing work, or doing any type of activities in their territory. And that's just being respectful, knowing that is their land, that is their treasured space that they are protecting and reinforcing. And so I'm acknowledging as a fellow Mi'kmaq Indigenous woman that I am coming in and asking kind of for their permission to come in and participate and be able to work in their territory. TRC, Truth and Reconciliation's inflection point. The TRC really did in 10 years, 11 years, actually, we just celebrated the 11th year of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission this year, increased the public's responsibility. So it was no longer a, I didn't know, I don't know. It's a they, them. It's out of sight, out of mind. It wasn't taught to me. It wasn't, at our kitchen table, all the different reasons that people can give. TRC said, here's 94 things that we have identified for you on your behalf to help you understand us as a people and the oppressive history that we've had to face with Canada and the Canadian government. And so in those themes have said, this is what we have recognized in regards to the health system. This is what we've recognized in the educational system. This is what we've recognized in the arts system. This is what we've recognized in the business and corporate sector. And so in all of those themes, which there's a few more, they've now said, these are the things we've recognized. These are the things that have to be done. And this is what you need to recognize and acknowledge, because this is the collective voices of Indigenous people from across Canada. And this is where the shift comes in, moving from what do we say, and that's what I hear a lot in different spaces within the business world is, what do we say? How do we say it? What's it going to change? I'm only one person. Well, it only took one person to start a movement of oppression. And so it'll take one person collectively, as a group, as an organization, as a country, to be able to make that shift in the right direction of reconciliation as well. Institutional adoption is another. We're seeing right across the board, right across Canada, universities and governments taking on this symbolic gesture of land acknowledgement. You can Google almost any institution in Canada, and you'll see that there's land acknowledgements. You'll see businesses and corporate citizens putting on their websites and in their email signatures various redemptions of land acknowledgement. The last part that we always worry about is the performative risk, and that's words spoken without any change or change. And this is why I really wanted to do a land acknowledgement presentation. Was if there hasn't been an exercise about the how and the why, then all of the words that you're saying out loud are just black and white letters that are on a piece of paper that have no soul, that have no spirit, that have no intention, and that you hold no responsibility to. And so this is why, having to talk about this exercise of a land acknowledgement is so important. Can move to the next slide. So what a land acknowledgement is and what it is not. It is a recognition of Indigenous presence. It's about truth telling. It's about how we are contributing to a relationship, our place in the responsibility of it, and the doorway to action, right? So there's this story that talks about, you can bring a horse to water, but you can't make him drink it. Well, you can bring people to the door, but you can't force them to walk through it. You can do all the efforts in making it, but if they don't want to go through the door and go on the journey of reconciliation, then it's up to the person. And it depends too where they're at too on the spectrum of where they're at in their journey of reconciliation. So what a land acknowledgement is not. It is not considered consultation, which consultation, big C consultation, is a legal requirement and a legal binding activity, and it's not consent. It's not saying this COI, this collection of Indigenous communities are agreeing to the words and the position of us because of this declaration. And nor is it considered compensation, saying, we've given you acknowledgement, this should be some type of compensative measure, which it is not. And it's not a checkbox to be checked saying reconciliation has been completed by our organization or individual. The key to a land acknowledgement is about opening the door, but not closing the door to a conversation. And it's a long conversation. It could be a lifetime. I am, what's TRC, 11? I'm 11 years into my reconciliation journey. I've been unlearning to relearn myself. I've been doing the healing that needs to be made, the truth that I need to be told, and the truth that I've had to say myself. And where do I see myself in that relationship journey? And acknowledging my responsibility as a citizen, as someone in the corporate sector, as a business owner, and then the personal side of me as a wife and a mother and a daughter and a grandmother. So, that to me has been very eye-opening for me for the last 11 years. We can move to the next slide. So treaties across Canada. Treaties are living relationships. The treaties that have been signed across the country with Indigenous people in the Crown are sacred covenants between the nations carrying their legal, their political, and their spiritual weight. Geographic diversity. From peace and friendship treaties that were signed here in the East Coast, in the Maritimes, to numbered treaties that are across the prairies into the West. Modern treaties, which you see in BC, comprehensive land claims that still are being negotiated today, and all of the unceded territories, which covers much of BC and other areas, remain to be declared unceded as well. In your localized learning, each institution must learn the specific treaty of their land of context. One of the activities that we use to help in this learning journey is the Kairos blanket exercise. The blanket exercise is an interactive learning tool that it's about 2.5 to 3 hours, encompassing a group of 10 or more, that talks about 300 to 500 years of history of Indigenous people in Canada and all of the events in history. And there's excerpts in there, and it's interactive. It requires the physical participation of individuals in this, hearing a narrative from an Indigenous and a Western perspective, and then the reading of scrolls, excerpts from Indigenous people throughout history. And so it's a really insightful tool to use. Can move to the next slide. So we're all treaty people, but we're just not all treaty people in the same way. So Indigenous people, we carry our inherent rights, our ancestral responsibilities to protect our territories and our resources within. Non-Indigenous people also carry a responsibility to uphold the treaties and respect the Indigenous sovereignty. 3, as newcomers entering existing treaty relationships, must also or are asked to learn the history of their new home and the people that they are co-sharing this land and space with. 4, institutions. Institutions proactively should be hiring or procuring Indigenous businesses and some practices that reflect the local treaty understanding of the Indigenous people and where they're doing business at. Can move to the next slide. TRC calls to action and why they matter. Like I had said, there's 94 calls to action, but these were the ones that were kind of more at a high level that we had picked to give you examples of maybe some of the audience that we have participating in this learning exercise. So call 57, public servants. The core requirement is professional development on Aboriginal history, residential schools, and treaties. Call 62 in the educational system, integrate Indigenous knowledge into classrooms across Canada. Call to 63, students and teachers, to develop intercultural understandings, to practice empathy and mutual respect. Call to action 92 in the business sector, adopt reconciliation frameworks and anti-racism education. And calls 93 to 94 for newcomers, revise citizenship materials to reflect Indigenous history and their treaty responsibilities. Move to the next slide. Residential schools and the historical trauma are very important to acknowledge and remember when we're doing land acknowledgement. They definitely impacted many generations of, denied language, denied teachings, denied culture, and denied relationships. And so that's really impacted how we are and a people today. And so the systemic colonial policy, residential schools were a centralized system that was designed to sever children from their families, to sever language, to sever culture. And so when you're talking about land acknowledgement, you're going back to a time when way before all of these systems had come into place and these policies had impacted the Indigenous people. Multi-generational impact, the trauma still today continue to ripple through our families. Preserving survivor truths. One of the great things about the Residential Truth and Reconciliation Commission, when it did their tour across the country, gathering stories from our survivors, was that different survivors who could and would share their story and their experience at residential school, carry their truth, and they wanted to be able to share it somewhere so that someone would be able to learn from or understand who they were. And the impact of their experience at the residential school. Responsibility in teaching. Be honest without turning trauma into a casual lesson. And that's why I have great respect for the Kairos blanket exercise, because, in that we're sharing, sometimes personal stories and some traumatic times within Indigenous people. And it's not just a casual lesson, it's a chapter in the days and the life of many Indigenous people in this country. And so we're not telling the story to ask for pity, we're telling the story so that people can understand, where we're at and what's impacted our familial lines. Path to healing. Once we understand history, it's, a major prerequisite to how impactful your land acknowledgement is going to be. And that's really key. Can we move to the next slide? Residential schools carried, historical trauma, but in this, there were children learning how to be, learning who they are, and learning about what relationships meant interpersonally, intergenerationally, different culture, like culturally, interculturally. So that's a lot to do in that 60 to 70 year timeline of the residential school. The last residential school closed in Canada in 1997. So, the first ones opened in the early 1900s till 1997. My oldest daughter was born in 1996. So had we been born in a different place in Canada, we would have had 5 generations of residential school survivors in my family. And that really hit home 11 years ago, when my family was able to tell their story at TRC in Halifax. And so that pivoted the trajectory of my professional journey. And I wanted to be a part of reconciliation. I wanted to be a part of the unlearning and the relearning. And I wanted to be a part of having those uncomfortable conversations in safe places. And that's the service that we offer in our business, is supporting people through that. Because, if we don't talk about the truth, then we'll never get past the hurt and pain into being able to live in a space, and especially in a business environment as well, where our resources of Indigenous people are what is Canada and corporate Canada are thriving from. We can move to the next slide. To white seeing, so I mentioned this earlier on in our slides, at Wampum. So Indigenous knowledge is ways of knowing that's rooted in the relationship to land and community. The second is having a deeper understanding. The goal of integrating both ways of knowing, understanding Western and the Indigenous, is so key and so fluid. Once you start to put that into practice, you really get to see the world literally from 2 lenses. And it's, a really empowering activity and practice once you start to engage in that type of approach. The Western knowledge has its strengths of science and academic traditions. But the key thing about, when we're talking about an Indigenous lens and Indigenous frameworks is having the respect and the consent. Indigenous knowledge is engaged through formal protocols and permission, not mined or appropriated. Historically, that's what worked against us, because there was no respect and there was no consent. And so duty to consult, OCAP is another, asking for the permission for the use of data, information, and stories by Indigenous people, and respecting their position. Like, they may say yes to today, but they can easily say no to tomorrow. And you have to respect that position of the Indigenous person in what they're sharing in that story they would have gathered from community or an elder. The lastly is the reciprocity in the relationship. So moving from transactional towards valuing both systems in practice is key to success in this. And the next slide. What makes a land acknowledgement meaningful? So we think about the first part is specific to the place. So where are you acknowledging that you are practicing your work, or where your home base is for your business? So name the specific nations that are relative to the area that you're referencing, the treaties that were signed and that should be recognized and acknowledged. And sometimes you can do the land features of the local area as well. You also have to be accurate and truthful. So you have to ensure that you're using the proper names and the terms that are preferred by the local Indigenous nations. Many nations are returning to their traditional Indigenous names, so making sure that you are writing those and being accurate in how you're writing down their Indigenous identifications. Spoken with understanding. So the speaker can explain that every word they use within that land acknowledgement, and can, put their spin on how they see themselves in that acknowledgement. Present tense focus. So acknowledging that Indigenous people are here, very well here today and now, and they are contributing to today in the economy. The connection and the responsibility. So naming sometimes some personal or institutional steps that are being taken, followed by action. So that would be kind of like your last statement within your land acknowledgement. The acknowledgement will lead to real change in behavior or practice. Next slide. So this is a little step-by-step in creating your own land acknowledgement. So take some time. It takes about 3 to 5 minutes to kind of go through. First, like we had mentioned in the last slide, is locate the land and the applicable treaties that are in the area of practice and business that you're in. Sit some time to reflect and consider your relationship to the place and how you want that to be interpreted in your business practices, which most likely will align with the values and the mission statement that's being declared as a business. Acknowledging and recognize the history and any harms within the territory that you're making your land acknowledgement declaration. And then what your commitment is. So choose one concrete action to commit to. I will, for us, it's our continued learning and supporting our allies in corporate Canada. So that's a commitment that we make at Indigevisor is, we're here to help you at anywhere you're at in your learning, in your reconciliation spectrum. And there's no judgment. We'll meet you where you're at, and we'll help you advance through all the phases that you need to at the pace that you're comfortable with. And lastly is verification, right? So using plain language, no empty promises in it. And the key reminder is we begin with learning, not wording. And lastly, the last slide is moving from words to action. So we brought you to the door. We've unlocked it for you. It's up to you now to walk through it. And a land acknowledgement is a doorway, not a destination. There's going to be lots of learning, relationship, accountability, respect, and action. So Walal Yok, and thank you all for your commitment to this ongoing work.